The clinking of silverware against fine china at the gilded apron was usually a soothing, upscale hum. Tonight, it felt like the countdown to an execution. Susan sat perfectly still, her spine pressed hard against the velvet booth. At 62, she had learned that when the world spun out of control, the only thing you could control was your posture. Across the pristine white tablecloth, her only son John was leaning in so close she could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. His face was flushed, a dangerous crimson that clashed with his tailored charcoal suit. "Are you out of your mind, Mother?" John's voice wasn't a shout, but a venomous, sharp whisper that cut right through the ambient jazz playing overhead. "Look at him. Just look at him. He is my friend. He slept on our couch in college. And you're telling me that this is what's been happening behind my back?" Beside John, his wife Chloe was frantically tapping her manicured nails against her wine glass. Her eyes darted around the crowded restaurant, terrified that someone from their country club might overhear. "Susan, please," Chloe hissed, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "Think about the family name. Think about John's position at the firm. This is disgusting. It's predatory. You are a grieving widow, and he is capitalizing on your vulnerability." Susan didn't blink. She didn't look at her son, nor did she look at her daughter-in-law. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on the table, where her left hand was resting. Beneath the heavy fabric of the tablecloth, hidden from the judgmental eyes of her family, her fingers were tightly intertwined with another hand. It was a hand that was younger, rougher from actual manual labor, but incredibly warm. It belonged to Peter. Peter sat next to her, facing the firing squad without flinching. He didn't yell back. He didn't try to defend himself with cheap excuses. He just squeezed Susan's hand tighter, a silent, grounding anchor in the middle of a hurricane. "This isn't about my vulnerability, Chloe," Susan said. Her voice was remarkably steady, a contrast to the trembling deep inside her chest. "And it certainly isn't about John's college memories." "Then what the hell is it about?" John slammed his palm onto the table. A nearby waiter paused, adjusting his tray, before quickly walking in the opposite direction. John didn't care. The mask of the dutiful, successful son was completely gone, replaced by a raw, ugly desperation. "He's 34, Mom. You're old enough to be his mother. Do you honestly think he's here for your sparkling personality? He's a freelance contractor who can barely afford his own rent. He's after the house. He's after Dad's estate. The estate that belongs to me." There it was. The ugly truth, dragged out into the open under the soft amber lighting of a five-star restaurant. Susan felt a cold smirk touch the corners of her lips, though her heart ached with a familiar, dull pain. For 10 years, 10 long, agonizing years since her husband passed away, this was all it ever boiled down to. The estate. The 5-bedroom colonial house in the suburbs. The stock portfolio. The legacy. John hadn't called her on her birthday last month. He had sent an automated text message at 11:45 p.m. Chloe hadn't visited her when she was bedridden with a severe bout of the flu last winter, claiming they couldn't risk bringing germs back to their immaculate, childless condo. But they had found the time to send an estate lawyer to her house with a stack of pre-planning asset management documents, subtly hinting that it was time for Susan to step down as the primary trustee. They wanted her gone. They wanted her assets. And most of all, they wanted her to feel like she was already a ghost, waiting out her days in a quiet house until she had the decency to pass away and hand over the keys. "John, that is enough," Peter finally spoke. His voice was deep, calm, and entirely devoid of the panic John was trying to instigate. "You haven't asked your mother how she's doing once tonight. You haven't asked her if she's happy. You walked in here, saw us together, and immediately started talking about money." "Shut up, Peter," John snarled, pointing a shaking finger across the table. "You don't get a say in this. You betrayed me. You crawled into my mother's life when I wasn't looking. I brought you into our family, and you stabbed me in the back. I swear to God, if you don't walk out of this restaurant right now, I will call the police and have you dragged out for elder abuse." "Elder abuse?" Susan repeated, the absurdity of the words echoing in her mind. She finally looked up, her piercing blue eyes locking onto her son, the boy she had raised, the boy she had stayed up with during nights of fever. The man who now looked at her as nothing more than a legal obstacle blocking his next financial milestone. "You think Peter is abusing me, John?" Susan asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Because he's the only person who noticed that the roof was leaking last spring? Because he's the only one who sat with me on the anniversary of your father's death while you were away on a golf trip in Cabo? Where were you when the silence in that house was loud enough to choke me?" John swallowed hard, his eyes flickering with a momentary flash of guilt before hardening back into cold arrogance. "We work, Mother. Chloe and I have careers. We are building a future. We can't be expected to hold your hand 24/7. That's why we suggested the retirement community in Scottsdale. You would have peers there. People your own age. Not this." He gestured aggressively at Peter. "Scottsdale is 3 states away, John," Susan said softly. "You wanted me out of sight. Out of mind. And most importantly, out of the deed." Chloe leaned forward, trying a different tactic. She reached out, attempting to pat Susan's arm, but Susan pulled away, placing her hand firmly back on the table, still holding Peter's. Chloe's expression soured for a fraction of a second before morphing back into a mask of deep concern. "Susan, sweetie, you're emotional right now," Chloe pleaded. "We love you. We just want what's best for you. But if this gets out, it will ruin us. People will talk. They'll say you're being manipulated. John is your only child. Don't let a stranger come between the blood that binds you. Sign the trust management over to John tonight. Let us handle the stress of the property, so you can focus on getting the help you clearly need." The help you clearly need. The implication was loud and clear. "Sign the papers, or we will tell the world you've lost your mind." Susan looked at Peter. His face was a mask of quiet strength, but she could see the tension in his jaw. He was enduring this public humiliation entirely for her. He wasn't defending his honor because he knew that any anger from him would only feed John's narrative. He was staying calm to keep her safe. 10 years of loneliness, 10 years of playing the quiet, grieving, obedient widow, suddenly crystallized into a single moment of absolute clarity. She looked at her son, the man who valued her net worth more than her existence, and then at the man beside her, who had loved her in the dark when nobody else was looking. "I am not signing anything, Chloe," Susan said, her voice echoing with a finality that made John freeze. John's eyes narrowed, the last remnants of his patience evaporating. "Then we will take this to court, Mother. I will have a judge declare you mentally unfit to manage the estate. I will drag this through every legal channel until you have nothing left to give to this parasite." Susan didn't flinch. Slowly, she withdrew her hand from Peter's, stood up, and picked up her leather handbag. "Do what you feel you must, John," Susan said, looking down at her son with a profound sense of detachment. "But remember one thing. A mother knows her children. And right now, I don't recognize mine." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward the exit, Peter stepping perfectly in stride right beside her, leaving John and Chloe alone in the suffocating silence of their own greed. The heavy glass doors of the Gilded Apron closed behind them, cutting off the suffocating hum of judgment and greed. Outside, the autumn air was crisp, biting at Susan's cheeks as she walked briskly toward the parking lot. Her breath hitched in her throat. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. Peter kept pace beside her, his hands tucked quietly into his jacket pockets. He didn't rush her. He didn't offer empty platitudes like, "It's going to be okay," or "don't listen to them." He simply existed as a solid, unyielding presence in the crisp night. When they reached his modest, reliable sedan, Susan stopped. She leaned her lower back against the passenger door, closed her eyes, and let out a long, ragged breath that she felt down to her bones. "Are you all right?" Peter's voice was a low, gentle rumble, breaking the silence of the parking lot. Susan opened her eyes and looked at him. Under the harsh, amber glow of the parking lot streetlights, the lines on his face seemed more pronounced. He looked tired, not because of his age, but because he had just stood in the line of fire for a woman society told him he shouldn't love. "I'm not broken, Peter," she whispered, offering a faint, weary smile. "Just tired. Tired of being viewed as a bank account with a heartbeat." "Let's get you home," he said softly, opening the door for her. The drive back to the suburbs was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the tires against the asphalt and the low murmur of a late-night jazz station. Susan stared out the window, watching the city lights blur into the familiar, manicured greenery of her neighborhood. For 10 years, this drive had felt like returning to a mausoleum. When her husband, Richard, passed away from a sudden heart attack a decade ago, the silence in the 5-bedroom colonial house had been instantaneous and deafening. In the immediate aftermath, there had been a flurry of activity. Casseroles dropped off by neighbors, generic condolences from Richard's business associates, and John, a recent college graduate at the time, helping her organize the funeral. But then the world moved on. John moved to the city, climbed the corporate ladder, married Chloe, and built a life that seemed to have no space for a grieving mother. Susan remembered the first winter alone. A heavy snowstorm had trapped her inside for 3 days. The power had flickered out, and she had huddled under 3 layers of blankets in the dark, staring at the ceiling. She had called John. He had picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice hurried, the background noise of a bustling restaurant bleeding through the line. Hey mom, look, I'm in the middle of a client dinner. If the power's out, just call the utility company. I gotta go, love you. Click. That was the exact moment Susan realized that her role as a mother had been archived. She was a historical figure in her son's life, not a living, breathing part of it. As the years bled into one another, the silence in the house became her permanent roommate. She learned to cook meals for one, to watch the evening news just to hear a human voice, and to tuck herself into a bed that felt far too large for a single body. Then came the spring of last year. A brutal thunderstorm had ripped a section of shingles off her roof, causing water to slowly drip through the ceiling of the guest bedroom. Panicked, she had called a dozen contractors, all of whom gave her astronomical quotes or told her they couldn't come out for weeks. In a moment of desperation, she had reached out to John, asking if he knew anyone. John hadn't called back, but 2 days later, Peter had shown up on her doorstep holding a toolbox. Susan had remembered Peter as the quiet, polite boy who used to crash on their basement couch during college weekends. He had always been different from John, less interested in status, more grounded, a man who worked with his hands as an independent carpenter rather than chasing corporate titles. John mentioned you had a leak, Peter had said that morning, wiping his boots before stepping inside. I had a free afternoon. Let me take a look. He had climbed up onto the roof, patched the damage, and refused to take a single dime for it. When he came downstairs, noticing the cold pot of tea on her counter and the solitary plate in the sink, he hadn't hurried out the door. Instead, he had sat at her kitchen island and asked a question no one had asked her in years. How have you really been, Mrs. Vance? That single conversation had broken a dam. Over the next few months, Peter's visits became a regular occurrence. He would stop by after a long day on a job site, sometimes bringing a bag of groceries, sometimes just checking to make sure the old water heater wasn't acting up. They talked about everything. Susan told him about her youth, her dreams before she became a corporate wife, and the crushing weight of her isolation. Peter told her about his own struggles, the pressure of trying to build a small business in an unstable economy, and the profound loneliness of being a man who didn't fit into the hyper-competitive world his college peers inhabited. They became each other's sanctuary. For Peter, Susan's home was a place of peace, free from the relentless hustle of the city. For Susan, Peter was a lifeline, a reminder that she was still a person worthy of being listened to, cared for, and seen. The transition from companionship to something deeper hadn't been a sudden, reckless impulse. It had been a slow, inevitable gravitational pull. It was the way his hand lingered a second too long when he handed her a cup of coffee. It was the way her chest tightened with a strange, youthful nervousness whenever his truck pulled into the driveway. Society had strict rules about women like her. She was supposed to fade gracefully into the background, to wear neutral colors, to content herself with gardening, and to live vicariously through her son's achievements. She wasn't supposed to feel desire. She wasn't supposed to want to be held. But Peter looked at her not as John's aging mother, and not as Richard's wealthy widow. He looked at her as Susan. The car pulled into her driveway, the headlights sweeping across the dark facade of the colonial house. The property looked immaculate, but to Susan, it just looked like a golden cage. Peter turned off the engine. The sudden quiet of the night settled over them. "John's threats aren't empty," Susan said softly, staring at the steering wheel. "He's ambitious, Peter. When he wants something, he uses every legal and social tool at his disposal to get it. He will try to ruin you. He will try to tell the world that you're a grifter." Peter unbuckled his seatbelt and turned in his seat to face her. He reached out his large, warm hand gently covering hers. "Let him try." "You don't understand," Susan countered, a flicker of fear piercing through her calm exterior. "The legal fees alone could drain everything you've worked to build. And the gossip. This town is small-minded, Peter. They will paint a hideous picture of us." "Susan, look at me," Peter said, his voice firm, grounding her. She turned her head to look at him. His dark eyes were filled with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I didn't start coming here for your house, and I didn't stay for your husband's money," Peter said, each word deliberate and heavy with truth. "I stayed because when I'm with you, the world makes sense. If John wants a fight, we give him a fight. But you are not going back into that dark house alone, and you are never going to be pushed into a corner by people who only value you when you're compliant." A tear finally escaped Susan's eye, tracking a warm path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. For 10 years, she had been the protector of her family's legacy, the dutiful widow, the accommodating mother. But as she looked at Peter, she realized she didn't want to protect the past anymore. She wanted to protect her future. "He thinks I'm weak because I've been quiet," Susan whispered, her voice hardening with a newfound resolve. "He thinks because I tolerated his neglect, I will tolerate his cruelty." "Are we going to show him otherwise?" Peter asked, a small, supportive smile touching his lips. Susan squeezed his hand back, the warmth spreading through her veins, chasing away the last of the evening's chill. "Yes, we are." The weeks following the restaurant confrontation felt like the tense, heavy stillness before a torrential downpour. John's threats had not been hollow. Within days, Susan received a formal letter from a high-profile estate litigation firm in the city, demanding a comprehensive audit of the Vance family trust and strongly suggesting a voluntary competency evaluation for Susan. The strategy was clear: isolate her, humiliate her, and scare her into signing over the keys to the kingdom. Every morning, Susan sat at her kitchen island, staring at the manicured backyard that had once brought her peace. Now it felt like a battlefield. John had stopped calling entirely. Instead, Chloe had taken over the psychological warfare, leaving vague, patronizing voicemails about how deeply concerned the family was and how they were praying Susan would make the right choice before things got public. But Susan wasn't the fragile woman they thought she was. Decades of being married to a high-powered corporate executive like Richard had taught her a thing or two about strategy. She knew how sharks moved. More importantly, she knew how her son operated. John was arrogant, and arrogant people always assumed their opponents were blind. "You're quiet today," Peter said, stepping into the kitchen. He had just finished repairing the hinges on the old garage door, a smudge of grease dark against his forearm. He set his toolbox down with a soft metallic thud and walked over to her, instinctively placing a warm hand on her shoulder. Susan leaned her head back against his chest, drawing strength from his steady heartbeat. "I'm just rewriting the script, Peter. John thinks he's playing a game of intimidation. He expects me to hire a defense lawyer and hide in this house until the court date." "And what are we actually going to do?" Peter asked, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. Susan looked up, her blue eyes sharp and entirely devoid of fear. "We're going to give him exactly what he wants. An audience." The escalation reached its boiling point on a Thursday evening. Susan had deliberately invited John and Chloe to the house under the pretense of discussing a peaceful resolution. She knew their greed would bring them running. When the front door opened, John didn't even bother to take off his coat. He marched into the living room, his face masked with a patronizing expression of pity, Chloe hovering right behind him like a vulture waiting for a meal. "I'm glad you finally came to your senses, Mom," John said, pulling a thick leather folder from his briefcase and setting it on the mahogany coffee table. "This doesn't have to be ugly." These papers just transfer the primary trustee status to me. You'll still have an allowance. You'll still be taken care of. But the liability, the property decisions, that stays with the family. The family, Susan repeated softly, sitting on the sofa. She looked elegant, dressed in a sharp navy blouse, her posture immaculate. Yes, Susan, Chloe chimed in, adjusting her designer handbag on her shoulder. And it's for your own protection. Honestly, having strangers lurking around the property? It's a liability. We've already drafted a severance agreement for Peter. He'll be compensated for his handiwork, of course, but he needs to cut ties immediately. Right on cue, Peter walked into the living room from the kitchen. He wasn't wearing his work clothes tonight. He wore a clean, dark button-down shirt. He didn't say a word. He simply walked over and stood right behind Susan's sofa, his presence a silent wall of support. John's eyes snapped to Peter, his jaw clenching. What is he still doing here? Mom, I told you, this is a family meeting. He doesn't belong in this room. Actually, John, he does, Susan said, her voice terrifyingly calm. Because Peter is the only reason this house hasn't fallen apart, emotionally or physically, over the last 2 years. Oh, for God's sake. John slammed his hand onto the armrest of the adjacent chair. I'm sick of the guilt trips. You're an adult, Mom. Millions of widows live alone. You aren't special because you're lonely. What makes you special is that you have a multi-million-dollar estate that my father built, and you're letting a 34-year-old gigolo manipulate you into throwing it away. John, watch your mouth, Peter said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. He didn't step forward, maintaining his boundaries, but the sheer weight of his tone made John blink. Or what, Peter? You'll sue me. John sneered, turning back to Susan. Look at him, Mom. He's using you. If you don't sign these papers right now, the lawsuit moves forward tomorrow. I will file for temporary conservatorship. I will tell the judge that you are suffering from cognitive decline brought on by prolonged grief, and I will use your association with this man as proof that you are no longer capable of making rational decisions. Do you really want that? Do you want the Vance name dragged through the mud in open court? Chloe nodded eagerly. Think about the country club, Susan. Think about how people will look at you. A 62-year-old woman sleeping with her son's college friend? It's predatory on his part, and frankly, pathetic on yours. The word pathetic echoed in the large room. For a second, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Susan looked at her son. She looked at the sharp, greedy lines of his face. She remembered holding him in the hospital room when he was born. She remembered the sacrifices she and Richard had made to send him to the best schools, to give him a life of absolute privilege. And this was the return on her investment. A threat to lock her away in a psychological ward, so he could liquidate her life. Slowly, Susan reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. She tapped the screen, turning it off. It had been recording the entire conversation. You talk a lot about your father's legacy, John, Susan said, standing up. She walked over to the desk by the window and picked up a slim, yellow envelope. But you forget that your father didn't build this estate alone. I managed the finances. I organized the investments. Richard was the face of the company, but I was the foundation. She walked back to the coffee table and tossed the yellow envelope right on top of John's legal documents. What is this? John asked, his brow furrowing as he reached for it. That is a copy of a freshly notarized, irrevocable amendment to the Vance Family Trust, which I executed 3 days ago, Susan said, folding her arms, along with a complete liquidation order for the stock portfolio. John's fingers fumbled with the envelope, ripping it open. Chloe leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the legal text. As John read the pages, the color completely drained from his face. His hands began to visibly shake. You dissolved the primary accounts? John whispered, his voice cracking. You can't do that. The tax penalties alone. The tax penalties have already been paid, John, Susan interrupted, her voice steady and ruthless. I have spent the last 2 weeks working with your father's old accounting firm. The one you thought was too outdated to use. Every single dollar of the liquid estate, totaling roughly $4.2 million, has been transferred into a blind charitable foundation for the construction of affordable housing units in the city. Chloe gasped, clutching her throat. You gave it away? You gave away our money. It was never your money, Chloe, Susan said, turning a cold gaze onto her daughter-in-law. And as for this house, Susan gestured to the sprawling, empty living room around them. The listing went live this morning. It already has 2 corporate buyers bidding above asking price. The proceeds of the sale will also go directly to the foundation. John stood up so fast his chair screeched against the hardwood floor. He looked frantic, his chest heaving as his corporate arrogance shattered into a million pieces. Are you insane? You left me nothing? I am your only son. I am a Vance. You are a man who tried to blackmail his mother in her own living room, Susan said, stepping closer to him, forcing him to look into her eyes. You wanted the estate, John? There is no estate left. There is nothing for a judge to take away from me. There is no property for you to manage. If you take me to court tomorrow, you will be spending your own savings to sue a woman who owns nothing but her clothes and a modest bank account. John stared at her, completely paralyzed. He looked at the documents, then at the phone in her hand, realizing that his threats of conservatorship had been captured on audio. Any legal battle he attempted now would only expose his own greed and ruin his career. He was trapped utterly and completely by the very system he had tried to weaponize against his mother. Mom, please, John stammered, the venom suddenly vanishing from his voice, replaced by the pathetic whine of a child who had just realized his privilege was gone. You can't do this. Chloe and I, we have a mortgage. We have expansions planned at the firm. We counted on this. Then I suggest you work harder, Susan said, her voice softening, but with the cold finality of an iron gate slamming shut. Because the bank of your lonely mother is officially closed. Chloe grabbed John's arm, her face twisted in a mixture of rage and panic. John, let's go. She's completely lost it. She's throwing her life away for a contractor. Let them be broke together. They turned and walked toward the front door, their exits rushed, undignified, and loud. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, the sound reverberating through the house one last time. Then the silence returned. But for the first time in 10 years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt clean. It felt like space. Susan stood in the center of the room, her shoulders finally dropping. The adrenaline left her all at once, and she felt a slight sway in her step. Before she could stumble, Peter was there. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her into his chest, holding her so tightly that the remaining tremors in her body finally stopped. You were incredible, Peter whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. Susan buried her face in his neck, breathing in the scent of cedar and rain. She looked around the empty, beautiful room that would soon belong to someone else. She had given away millions. She had severed the tie with her only child. To the rest of the world, she had just committed social and financial suicide. But as she looked up into Peter's warm, devoted eyes, she knew the truth. She hadn't lost anything. She had just bought her freedom. The packing boxes stacked in the grand foyer looked like cardboard monuments to a life Susan was finally ready to leave behind. It had been 3 weeks since the confrontation, and the real estate market had moved with a brutal, satisfying efficiency. The house had sold to an executive relocation firm, all cash, with a closing period so short it felt like a mercy killing. The moving truck was scheduled to arrive at dawn. Susan stood in the center of her empty master bedroom, holding a small silver-framed photograph of her late husband, Richard. She traced the edge of the metal with her thumb. She didn't feel sadness, nor did she feel regret. She felt a profound, quiet gratitude for the years they had shared. But she also knew that the man in the photograph would have despised what their son had become. Richard had been tough, but he had never been cruel. He had valued legacy, but he had valued honor more. A soft knock on the doorframe broke her trance. Peter was leaning against the jamb, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a streak of packing tape dust on his cheek. He held 2 paper cups of lukewarm coffee from the drive-thru down the street. The kitchen is officially cleared out, Peter said, stepping into the room and handing her a cup. He glanced at the photograph in her hand, his expression softening with that innate, respectful understanding that had made her fall for him in the first place. How are you holding up? I'm doing remarkably well, Susan said, setting the frame gently into the open bubble wrap box at her feet. She took a sip of the bitter coffee, welcoming the warmth. I thought leaving this room would feel like ripping off a band-aid. Instead, it just feels like taking off a heavy coat at the end of winter. Peter walked over, wrapping his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head. The real estate agent called while I was downstairs. The final walkthrough is set for noon tomorrow. John's lawyer tried to call her office this morning. Susan didn't flinch. What did he want? He wanted to know if the charitable transfer could be contested under the grounds of undue influence from an outside party. Peter murmured, his arms tightening around her slightly. The agent told him the paperwork was ironclad, filed through a Tier 1 corporate firm, and that any attempt to freeze the funds would result in a countersuit for malicious litigation that would destroy John's partnership track at his firm. Susan let out a small, dry laugh. John always forgets that I sat through 25 years of corporate dinners listening to his father explain how to protect assets from hostile takeovers. He thought he was the only one who learned how to fight. She turned around in Peter's embrace, looking up into his face. The tension that had lived under his eyes for the past month had begun to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, determined resolve. I'm sorry he's still trying to drag you into this, Peter. He can try all he wants, Peter said, kissing her brow. He's fighting for a ghost, Susan. The money is gone. The house is gone. The only thing left here is you, and he can't file a motion to repossess a woman's heart. The next morning, the movers arrived with the rising sun. The house, which had once felt like a museum dedicated to her grief, was stripped bare in a matter of hours. Every thud of a heavy box echoing down the hallway felt like a heartbeat returning to a dead body. By 11 o'clock, the truck had pulled away, leaving Susan and Peter alone in the empty living room. The hardwood floors were marked with the faint geometric shadows of furniture that had sat in the same spots for a quarter of a century. Susan walked to the large bay window, overlooking the manicured front lawn. A sleek, black European sedan pulled up to the curb. Her heart gave a singular, heavy thud. It was John. He didn't exit the car immediately. He sat behind the wheel for a long minute, staring at the sold sign slapped across the real estate placard in the yard. When he finally opened the door, he looked completely different from the arrogant, sharp-tongued executive who had tried to corner her at the Gilded Apron. His tie was slightly askew, his jacket was unbuttoned, and the supreme confidence that usually defined his posture was entirely absent. He looked defeated, hollowed out by the reality of his own miscalculation. He's here, Susan said quietly. Peter walked up beside her, looking out the window. Do you want me to tell him to leave? Susan shook her head. No. This is the final audit, Peter. I need to close the ledger. I'll be in the truck, Peter said, squeezing her hand before walking toward the back exit. He knew this wasn't his conversation to have. He had protected her from the storm. Now, she needed to walk through the clearance. The front door clicked open, the sound echoing loudly in the barren hallway. John stepped inside, his leather dress shoes clicking against the bare wood. He stopped at the threshold of the living room, looking around at the empty space, before his eyes finally settled on his mother. It's really gone, John said, his voice hollow, stripped of its usual corporate cadence. The mover said you liquidated the family heirlooms too. Dad's antique desk. The grandfather clock. Everything. They were just things, John, Susan said, her hands resting calmly in the pockets of her linen trousers. Things that required a massive, expensive house to keep them alive. I don't need a grandfather clock to know that time is passing. John took a few steps forward, stopping a respectful distance away. He looked at her, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time in 10 years. Chloe left for her mother's house last night, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. The firm found out about the potential lawsuit. They didn't care about the details, Mom. They just cared about the word conservatorship being attached to a senior associate's name. They passed me over for the senior partnership this morning. They gave it to Marcus. Susan felt a momentary twinge in her chest, the vestigial instinct of a mother wanting to comfort her child. But she suppressed it, remembering the absolute lack of mercy in his eyes when he had threatened to have her committed to an asylum for her assets. Actions have consequences, John, Susan said softly. You tried to use the legal system as a weapon to starve out your mother. The system didn't break me. It just exposed you. I was desperate. John burst out, the raw, ugly truth finally spilling out of him. He took another step closer, his eyes pleading. We were drowning, Mom. Chloe's lifestyle, the mortgage on the condo, the bad investments I made last year trying to look like a big shot. We were living paycheck to paycheck on a $500,000 income. I thought you didn't need it. You were just sitting here in this massive house doing nothing. I figured if we took over the trust, we could use the equity to clear our debts, and you wouldn't even notice the difference. You thought I wouldn't notice that my own son viewed me as an inconvenience with a high net worth? Susan's voice wasn't angry. It was laced with a profound, crushing disappointment. You thought because I didn't complain about your silence, I was stupid? I stayed in this house, John, because I was waiting for you to remember that you had a mother. I kept this estate intact because I wanted to leave you a legacy. But you didn't want a legacy. You wanted a payout. John lowered his head, his shoulders shaking. A single, genuine tear rolled down his cheek, tracing a path through the exhaustion on his face. Are you ever going to forgive me? Susan looked at her son. The man she had built her entire adult life around. The boy she had protected from every hardship. She realized then that by protecting him too much, she had failed to teach him how to be a human being. Forgiveness is a process, John, Susan said, her voice steady but gentle. But forgiveness doesn't mean restoration. The trust is gone. The house is sold. And I am moving away. John snapped his head up. Where? Where are you going? Somewhere small, she replied, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time during the conversation. Somewhere where the silence doesn't hurt. With him. John spat out the words, a final, reflexive gasp of his old resentment. With Peter, Susan corrected him firmly. The man who came to check on your father's widow when you were too busy climbing a ladder that turned out to be made of sand. John swallowed hard, the finality of the statement sinking into his chest. He looked around the empty room one last time, realizing that he had not only lost his inheritance, but he had legally and emotionally evicted himself from his mother's life. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the house. The heavy front door clicked shut behind him, the latch catching with a soft, definitive snap. Susan stood in the empty room for a moment longer, letting the finality of the moment wash over her. Then she turned her back on the bay window, walked out the rear door, and stepped into the autumn sunlight where Peter was waiting, his truck idling, ready to drive into the unknown. The drive toward the coast felt less like a geographic journey, and more like a collective shedding of skin. As Peter's truck ate up the miles of coastal highway, the heavy, sprawling suburbs of New Jersey faded into a memory of gray stone and manicured lawns. In their place came the vast, unbothered horizon of the Atlantic Ocean, its dark blue waves crashing relentlessly against the jagged shoreline. The air that seeped through the cracked windows was different here, salty, sharp, and smelling faintly of low tide and wild sea grass. Susan sat in the passenger seat, her hands resting quietly in her lap. For the first time in 10 years, she wasn't tracking the time. She wasn't wondering if John would call. She wasn't worrying about a leaking roof. And she wasn't calculating the emotional cost of her own existence. She simply watched the gray-green coastal marshes roll past. Beside her, Peter drove with one hand on the wheel, his expression relaxed but entirely present. Every few miles, his eyes would flicker toward her, checking in without needing to ask a single question. He understood that the silence she was wrapped in wasn't a sad one. It was the quiet of a deep-sea diver finally breaking the surface and drawing a full breath of oxygen. By late afternoon, the truck slowed down as they entered a small, sleepy coastal town that seemed to exist entirely outside the frantic pace of the modern world. The streets weren't lined with luxury boutiques or high-end car dealerships. Instead, there were small bait shops, a local diner with neon lettering that had seen better days, and modest, weathered shingle-style cottages tucked behind the sand dunes. Peter pulled the truck down a narrow, unpaved gravel driveway that crunched loudly under the tires. The driveway led toward a small, two-bedroom cottage perched on a slight incline overlooking a secluded cove. It was a humble structure. Its cedar shingles bleached a soft gray by decades of salt air and sun. with a small covered porch that faced directly toward the open sea. "We're here," Peter said, turning off the ignition. The sudden quiet of the engine was immediately replaced by the rhythmic, booming roar of the ocean waves just 100 yards away. Susan opened her car door and stepped out onto the gravel. The coastal wind caught her hair, whipping it across her face, but she didn't mind. She walked toward the edge of the porch, looking out at the water. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the underbelly of the clouds in brilliant streaks of violet, amber, and deep copper. Peter walked up behind her, carrying 2 of the smaller suitcases from the truck bed. He set them down and stood next to her, his shoulder brushing against hers. "It's not the colonial house," Peter said quietly, his voice laced with a sudden, rare note of vulnerability. He looked at the modest cottage, then at her, as if suddenly worried that the transition from a multi-million-dollar estate to a simple seaside rental might finally hit her. "The floors creak when the wind blows hard, and the water pressure in the shower takes a minute to get going. I know it's a far cry from what you're used to." Susan turned to look at him. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the hard line of his jaw, feeling the slight roughness of his afternoon stubble. "Peter," she said softly, her voice filled with an absolute, unwavering certainty. "That colonial house was a beautiful tomb. I spent a decade polishing the silver and maintaining the gardens just to convince myself that I was still alive. This." She gestured toward the small porch, the weathered wood, and the infinite horizon of the ocean. "This is a home, because the man who cares if I breathe is inside it." A slow, relieved smile broke across Peter's face. He leaned down, catching her lips in a kiss that tasted faintly of salt and late summer warmth. It wasn't a rushed, desperate kiss. It was a promise. A quiet declaration that the storm had passed, and they were finally allowed to belong to each other in the light of day. They spent the remaining hours of the evening moving their few belongings inside. There were no movers, no heavy antique grandfather clocks to position perfectly against a wall, and no expensive artwork to align under track lighting. There were just boxes of books, comfortable clothes, a few old kitchen pots, and the silver-framed photograph of Richard, which Susan placed gently on a small built-in shelf next to the fireplace. As night fell, the temperature dropped significantly, the coastal chill pressing against the window panes. Peter set to work building a small, efficient fire in the stone hearth, using dry driftwood he had gathered from the woodbox on the porch. Within minutes, the living room was bathed in a warm, amber glow, the crackle of the wood competing with the distant hum of the surf. Susan made a simple dinner, pasta with fresh garlic and olive oil, served on mismatched ceramic plates they had found in the cottage's cabinets. They sat together on a worn, overstuffed navy sofa that faced the hearth, their legs tangled beneath a heavy wool blanket. "John will find out where you are eventually," Peter murmured, staring into the dancing flames. He was holding a glass of wine, his thumb mindfully stroking the back of Susan's hand. "The real estate lawyers have the forwarding address for the remaining tax documents. He'll look for you." Susan leaned her head against Peter's shoulder, watching the smoke curl up the chimney. "Let him look. He'll find a woman who owns a used car, a modest savings account, and a life he has no legal or financial claim over. When John realizes there is no leverage left to use against me, he will stop looking. He doesn't chase things that don't yield a profit." It was a harsh assessment, but it was the truth. She had stripped away the only bait her son cared about. Without the inheritance, she was just an aging woman living by the sea, invisible to the corporate world John inhabited. "And what about us?" Peter asked, turning his head to look down at her. The firelight caught the deep, intense honesty in his eyes. "Are you worried about what the people back home are saying? The rumors? The things Chloe is probably telling anyone who will listen?" Susan let out a long, slow breath, letting the last remnants of her old life dissolve into the warmth of the room. She thought about the country club, the polite neighborhood gossip, the rigid expectations of how a proper widow was supposed to age into obscurity. "For 30 years, Peter, I lived my life according to a script written by other people," Susan said, her voice dropping to a soft, resonant whisper. "I was the perfect corporate wife. I was the accommodating mother. I was the grieving, quiet widow. I spent so much time worrying about what the world thought of me that I forgot that the world doesn't care when you're lonely in the dark." She shifted closer to him, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce, independent fire. "Let them talk," she said. "Let them call me crazy. Let them say I threw it all away. They think I lost my mind, but the truth is I finally found my soul. I love you, Peter. And for the first time in my life, I don't need anyone's permission to say it." Peter didn't answer with words. He set his wine glass down on the floor, wrapped his strong arms around her, and pulled her down against the cushions. As the fire crackled and the ocean roared outside, they held each other in the quiet safety of their new beginning. Two lonely people who had finally found their way to shore. The winter came to the coast not with a sudden freeze, but with a relentless slate-gray dampness that turned the ocean into a churning sheet of steel. The small cottage, however, held the cold at bay. Peter had spent the early weeks of November weather-stripping the windows and reinforcing the porch against the Atlantic gales. On a Tuesday afternoon, as a bitter wind rattled the cedar shingles, Susan sat by the window, a thick ceramic mug of tea warming her palms. Outside, a familiar black European sedan pulled down the gravel driveway, its tires crunching slowly over the frozen stones. "John." Susan didn't jump up. Her heart didn't race. She simply set her mug down on the windowsill and watched her son step out into the coastal cold. He wasn't wearing his tailored charcoal suit today. He wore a heavy generic winter coat, his hair slightly disheveled by the wind. He looked smaller against the backdrop of the open sea. The front door opened before he could knock. Peter stood at the threshold, a heavy flannel shirt over his broad shoulders. He didn't block the door aggressively, but his posture was an undeniable boundary. "I just want to talk to my mother, Peter," John said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of the sharp corporate authority he usually wielded like a weapon. "I'm not here with lawyers. I'm not here for a fight. I drove 3 hours." Peter looked back into the living room. Susan gave a subtle, single nod. Peter stepped aside, leaving the door open as he walked out onto the porch, pulling his jacket on to give them space. He didn't go far, just enough to let them speak, but close enough to ensure she was safe. John stepped into the warmth of the cottage, wiping his boots on the mat. He looked around the small living room, taking in the mismatched furniture, the roaring fire, and the silver-framed photograph of his father sitting on the modest bookshelf. "It's small," John said softly, his eyes finally landing on Susan. "It's exactly the size I need, John," Susan replied, remaining seated by the window. "Why are you here?" John swallowed hard, shoving his hands deep into his pockets. "The divorce was finalized last week. Chloe took the condo and the remaining investments. I'm renting a studio apartment near the transit hub. The firm, they didn't fire me, but I've been sidelined. I'm managing the accounts no one else wants." Susan listened, her expression calm but observant. She felt a dull ache for the difficulties her son was facing, but the fierce, blinding urge to fix his life for him didn't materialize. He was a grown man experiencing the natural harvest of the seeds he had sown. "I spent the last 6 months hating you, Mom," John confessed, his voice cracking as he stared at the floorboards. "I told myself you were selfish. I told myself that Peter had brainwashed you into destroying my future. But then winter hit, and the city got incredibly quiet. And I realized I hadn't called you on a Tuesday in 7 years. I only ever called you when a bill was due or when Chloe wanted to host a dinner party to impress her friends." He looked up, his eyes rimmed with red, filled with a raw, ugly grief that had nothing to do with money. "You weren't throwing your life away. You were just leaving a house where nobody was talking to you." Susan stood up slowly. She walked over to her son, stopping a foot away. She didn't hug him, and she didn't offer the easy, cheap comfort of telling him his past actions were okay. But she did place a gentle hand on his arm. "I loved your father, John. And I loved raising you," Susan said, her voice rich with a quiet, unshakable strength. "But love shouldn't require a woman to disappear. I spent 10 years becoming invisible so that you and Chloe could feel successful. When I realized you were willing to lock me away in an asylum just to accelerate your inheritance, I realized that my silence was actually enabling your cruelty." John lowered his head, a single, heavy tear dropping onto the hardwood floor. "I am sorry, Mom. I am so incredibly sorry." "I know you are, John," Susan whispered. "And I forgive you. but the past cannot be rebuilt. The estate is gone, and the woman who kept it for you is gone too. If you want a relationship with me, you have to get to know the woman who lives here now. John looked toward the window, where Peter was standing on the porch, his back to the cold wind, keeping watch over the small house. He really loves you, doesn't he? John asked quietly. He saw me when I was a ghost, John, Susan said simply. And he stayed to help me find my voice. John nodded slowly, the finality of her new life settling heavily into his chest. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask her to change her will. For the first time in his adult life, he just looked at his mother as a human being who had a right to her own happiness. Can I call you next Tuesday? John asked, his voice barely a whisper. Susan smiled, a genuine, soft warmth returning to her eyes. I would like that very much, John. Just to talk. When the black sedan finally backed down the gravel driveway and disappeared into the coastal fog, Susan walked out onto the porch. Peter immediately stepped close, wrapping his strong arms around her from behind, shielding her from the biting ocean wind. You did well, Peter murmured against her neck. Susan leaned into his warmth, watching the gray waves crash against the shoreline. The ledger was finally closed. The anger was gone. In its place was a quiet winter peace, and the absolute certainty that she was finally, truly free. The coastal spring arrived not with a dramatic burst of warmth, but with a subtle softening of the horizon. The relentless gray of the Atlantic winter slowly yielded to a brilliant, pale blue, and the wild sea grass outside the cottage turned a vibrant, resilient green. Susan stood on the wooden porch, her bare feet pressing against the cedar planks that Peter had painstakingly sanded and sealed. The morning air was still cool, but the sun on her face felt like a quiet blessing. From the kitchen behind her, the rich, comforting aroma of brewing coffee and frying garlic drifted out, accompanied by the low, steady whistle of Peter humming a classic blues tune. She looked down at her hands. They were no longer the soft, heavily lotioned hands of a suburban socialite who spent her afternoons hosting charity luncheons she didn't care about. There was a faint callus on her palm from helping Peter tend to their small raised bed garden, and her nails were unvarnished. Yet, as she twisted the simple silver band Peter had given her on her right hand, she had never felt more beautiful. At 63, Susan had finally stopped waiting for her life to begin. A soft crunch of gravel broke the steady rhythm of the crashing waves. Susan looked up as a modest silver sedan, not the sleek black European model from her past, pulled into the driveway. The driver's side door opened, and John stepped out. He looked different now. The sharp, aggressive edge that had defined his corporate persona for a decade had softened. He wore a simple cotton sweater and a pair of worn jeans. In his arms he carried a small, potted lemon tree, its bright yellow fruit contrasting sharply with the coastal backdrop. "Morning, Mom," John said, walking up the porch steps with a tentative, respectful smile. "Good morning, John," Susan welcomed him, stepping forward to wrap her arms around his shoulders. The hug was no longer stiff or performative. It was grounded in the reality of who they were now. For the past 6 months, John had kept his promise. Every Tuesday evening, her phone would ring at precisely 7 p.m. There were no discussions about trusts, no complaints about his career setbacks, and no passive-aggressive comments about her lifestyle. They talked about the weather, a book John was reading, or the tomatoes Susan was trying to grow. They were learning to speak to each other as adults, stripped of the toxic expectations of inheritance. "I brought this for the porch," John said, setting the lemon tree down by the door. "The guy at the nursery said it thrives in coastal sunlight if you keep it shielded from the direct northern wind." "It's perfect, John." "Thank you," Susan said, her heart swelling with a quiet maternal warmth. Peter stepped out onto the porch, holding 2 extra mugs of coffee. He stopped when he saw John, his expression calm and observant. The 2 men looked at each other for a long moment. There was no dramatic embrace, no tearful apology. Real life rarely operated on cinematic grandiosity. Instead, John reached out his hand, and Peter took it in a firm, respectful handshake. "Good to see you, John," Peter said, handing him one of the mugs. "The coffee's hot." "Thanks, Peter. Good to see you too," John replied, taking a sip and looking out at the vast, shimmering expanse of the ocean. "I get why you both love it here. It's incredibly peaceful. They stood together on the porch in a comfortable, easy silence, watching a flock of seagulls navigate the coastal updrafts. There was no ghost of the multi-million-dollar estate lingering between them. The golden cage had been dismantled, and from its pieces, they had built something far more durable. Later that afternoon, after John had driven back toward the city, Susan sat on the sofa, her head resting securely on Peter's shoulder as the evening chill began to roll in off the water. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting dancing amber shadows across the small room. Susan looked at the silver-framed photograph of Richard on the shelf. She realized then that true legacy wasn't measured in the square footage of a suburban house, or the commas in a bank account. Richard's true legacy wasn't the money John had fought for. It was the resilience he had passed down to her, the strength to demand a life of dignity. Family wasn't just a matter of shared blood or legal obligations. True family was found in the people who chose to sit with you in the quiet, dark corners of your loneliness. It was found in the hands that repaired your broken ceilings, the voices that asked how you were actually doing, and the hearts that didn't require you to be rich, compliant, or invisible just to be loved. Susan closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of cedar, salt, and the man beside her. She had given up a fortune to buy a weathered cottage by the sea, and as she drifted off to the rhythmic, eternal lullaby of the ocean, she knew she had made the greatest trade of her life. She was no longer a widow, she was no longer an inconvenience, and she was no longer a ghost. She was Susan, and she was finally home.